A low rumble grows beneath the silence, the distant echo of engines, the droning hum of 1,000 propellers. Clouds stretch endlessly over Europe, shrouding the continent below in shades of smoke and ash. Through the haze, the silhouettes of bombers emerge, vast formations of B-17 flying fortresses, their wings flashing in the thin sunlight. Beneath them lies a world already scarred, cities burning, rivers clogged with wreckage, and nations gasping under the weight of war. The year is 1943. The world has entered the 4th year of total conflict. The Allies are regaining their strength. The Axis still stands defiant. And above the skies of Europe, an invisible war rages every hour of every day. A war for air supremacy, for survival, for the future itself. At the start of 1943, the Luftwaffe, once the proud spear of Hitler's military machine, still casts a long shadow over the continent. Its fighter wings, the Jagdflieger, have fought since the first day of the war, from Poland to the Battle of Britain, through the snows of Russia and the deserts of Africa. They are veterans forged in the fire of endless combat. Their aces, men like Galland, Marcel, and Hartmann, are celebrated as heroes of the Reich. To the ordinary German citizen, the Luftwaffe seems unstoppable. But within its command rooms, cracks are spreading, subtle, almost invisible at first. The aircraft industry is overstretched, fuel reserves are tightening, training schools are emptying faster than they can be replenished. The skies no longer belong solely to Germany. In the West, the Royal Air Force continues its nightly raids, hammering Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. By day, a new threat rises, the United States Army Air Forces, flying from English fields under the banner of daylight precision bombing. Their strategy is simple but brutal. Cripple the German war machine by striking its factories, railways, and oil reserves from the air. The Luftwaffe's mission is clear: stop them. By the spring of 1943, the war in the air has become a deadly rhythm, each day a contest of endurance. The American bombers come in vast formations, flying tight boxes for mutual defense, bristling with machine guns, B-17s and B-24s, engines roaring, silver bodies glinting against the clouds. They move like floating fortresses, and that's exactly what they are. The German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, slice into the sky to meet them. They are agile, deadly, but short-legged. Their range barely reaches beyond the western borders of Germany. For months, this balance holds. Allied bombers can strike targets near the coast, but anything deeper into the Reich is suicide. Without fighter escorts, they are torn apart by German interceptors. Inside the Luftwaffe, confidence remains high. Göring himself boasts that no enemy bomber will ever reach the heart of Germany. He is wrong. Each night, the RAF takes its turn. Black-painted Lancasters and Halifaxes creep across the channel, guided by radar and moonlight. Each day, the Americans rise, tired, determined, faces lit by the dawn light over England. The sky above Europe has no pause, no silence. For the people below, the farmers of France, the villagers of Holland, the children hiding in German cellars, the sound of engines becomes part of daily life. Sleep becomes fragile. Dreams are interrupted by sirens, by the low heartbeat of approaching planes. In cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Essen, civilians live in a cycle of exhaustion. They sleep in bunkers, wake to rubble, and count the hours until nightfall when it begins again. For soldiers and pilots, sleep becomes a luxury, a battlefield of its own. The exhaustion of constant readiness eats at them as surely as the enemy's bullets. The human mind, deprived of rest, begins to blur the line between fear and hallucination. Some Luftwaffe aces report hearing phantom engines while on the ground, auditory illusions born from nerves and sleeplessness. The war in the air is not fought only with aircraft and bullets. It is fought with willpower, with the capacity to remain awake, alert, and alive. By mid-1943, the Allies are pushing deeper. Intelligence reports suggest that the Americans are testing new methods of long-range escort, external fuel tanks mounted under their fighters, experimental but promising. At first, German analysts dismiss the reports. Physics, they insist, forbids such endurance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for example, guzzles fuel like a tank. The P-38 Lightning, though efficient, cannot possibly cross the Rhine and return safely, or so they believe. But whispers circulate among frontline units. American fighters are being seen farther east than ever before. Pilots returning from interception missions swear they saw the twin-boom silhouette of P-38s near the Ruhr Valley. Headquarters dismisses as confusion, propaganda, or misidentification. Yet, amid the fog of disbelief, one man takes the reports seriously. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, Germany's inspector of fighters. Galland is no bureaucrat. He is a fighter pilot, a tactician, and above all, a realist. Having survived hundreds of missions, he knows firsthand the limits of men and machines. He also knows that underestimating one's enemy is the first step toward defeat. By the summer of 1943, Galland is growing increasingly frustrated. He sees the toll the war is taking on his pilots, the fatigue, the lack of replacements, the shortage of fuel and parts. Yet, higher command continues to issue grandiose promises and impossible orders. In Berlin, Göring surrounds himself with loyalists and flatterers. Few dare to contradict him. Those who do, like Galland, risk their careers, even their freedom. Still, Galland continues to report honestly. His network of officers collects detailed combat data. They notice patterns. American bombers penetrating deeper, their losses decreasing, and unfamiliar contrails appearing high above the formations, fighter escorts that should not be there. Then comes August 17, 1943, a day that will reshape the air war. That morning, the U.S. 8th Air Force launches two massive raids, one toward Regensburg, the other towards Schweinfurt, the heart of Germany's ball-bearing production. It is a gamble, deep strikes without adequate escort. Hundreds of B-17s lift off from England, their wings shimmering with condensation in the early dawn. They climb to altitude, form up over the North Sea, and head into the heart of the Reich. German radar stations light up. Alarms ring from France to Bavaria. Fighters scramble in waves. FW-190s, Bf-109s, climbing, diving, attacking relentlessly. But something unexpected happens. Reports begin to flow in. American fighters, P-38 Lightnings, are engaging over 150 miles inside German airspace. Impossible distances, impossible endurance. Yet they are there, unmistakable, twin tails glinting in the sun, guns blazing. To the men on the ground, it feels like a breach in reality itself. In East Prussia, Adolf Galland stands at a small railway platform, the air thick with the smell of coal and summer rain. A messenger rushes to him with reports from the Western Front. He reads in silence, his brow tightening. If the data is correct, then the Americans have achieved something extraordinary, the first successful long-range penetration into Germany, supported by fighters with drop tanks. Galland knows what it means. The Reich is no longer safe behind its borders. The myth of the impassable distance is broken. He closes the folder, staring into the distance, the horizon where the war's outcome is already beginning to shift. Soon, Galland will carry this report directly to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe. He will explain the implications, that the Americans can now escort their bombers deep into Germany, that the Luftwaffe must change its tactics immediately, that the era of short-range interception is over. Göring will listen, and then laugh. He will call it physically impossible. He will forbid further discussion of the subject. And with that decision, the fate of Germany's air defense will be sealed. For now, though, in August 1943, the war goes on. Pilots return to base, exhausted, many too tired to stand. Mechanics work through the night repairing shattered aircraft. The few hours of sleep they manage are shallow, haunted. They dream of engines that never stop turning, of tracer fire that cuts through the clouds, of home they may never see again. Across Europe, the sky is never silent. The thrum of engines becomes the lullaby of a dying world. Fade to black. A single voice, weary, reflective, almost whispering. They thought the enemy could not reach them. They thought distance would protect them. But in war, denial is the most dangerous illusion of all. And in the summer of 1943, that illusion began to burn away. One mission, one report, one conversation at a railway platform in East Prussia. The rain had not yet fallen on the small town of Westerholt when a young boy looked up at the clouds and decided he would not spend his life walking on the ground. His name was Adolf Galland, and even before the Great War had truly faded from Germany's memory, he felt the magnetic pull of flight. Airplanes were still fragile, their frames of wood and linen, their engines coughing like asthmatic beasts. But to the boy, they were the purest expression of freedom in a country still bound by defeat and bitterness. He read everything he could about flying machines, sketched biplanes in his schoolbooks, and watched the storks gliding over the fields, memorizing the effortless geometry of their wings. When the time he was 16, Galland was already chasing wind currents in his mind, picturing himself cutting through clouds. Germany was rebuilding its pride in secret. The Treaty of Versailles had banned military aviation, but glider clubs flourished under the guise of sport. To the young men who gathered on grassy hills with homemade wings, flight was both rebellion and religion. When Galland joined one of these clubs, he felt the first vibration of destiny, the sense that the sky would be both his sanctuary and his battlefield. When the clandestine Reichswehr transformed into the Luftwaffe, Galland was among the first to be chosen. The instructors saw something unusual in him, not just skill, but composure, the cool intelligence of someone who could see 3 moves ahead while others reacted in panic. In the early 1930s, he flew for the newly formed Air Force, testing aircraft that were still experimental, pushing them past the edge of structural safety. It was dangerous work. Several of his classmates were killed. Galland himself crashed more than once, emerging with scars that never quite healed, but his confidence only deepened. He began to understand that flying at its core was about balancing on the edge between control and chaos. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, Germany sent the Condor Legion, its first real testing ground for modern aerial combat. Galland volunteered. Over the skies of Spain, he learned the grammar of dogfighting: altitude, surprise, patience. He saw what bombs did to cities, what machine gun fire did to flesh, and the illusions of romantic warfare began to burn away. Yet even there, in the deadly sunlight above the Ebro Valley, he felt a strange peace. In the cockpit, the noise of politics and propaganda disappeared. There was only the hum of the engine, the wind against the canopy, and the absolute clarity that came when a man understood he might die in the next 5 seconds. When he returned to Germany, he was promoted rapidly. By 1939, as Europe slid into another war, Galland had become one of the Luftwaffe's most promising fighter leaders. The invasion of Poland, then France, then the Low Countries, each campaign expanded his reputation. He flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek and fast, its narrow wings demanding precision. His colleagues admired his calm authority. He didn't shout over the radio. He gave quiet orders that others instinctively obeyed. During the Battle of Britain, his name became legend. Galland's unit fought daily over the Channel, escorting bombers toward the English coast. The RAF was fierce and unyielding, and the German High Command demanded victory at any cost. Göring, sitting comfortably far from the battlefront, issued unrealistic directives.
The bombers must be protected at all times. The enemy must be destroyed in the air. The losses must remain minimal. It was Galland who first realized the contradiction. He understood that fighters could not both shield the bombers and hunt the enemy with freedom of maneuver. Every day he watched young pilots die obeying orders written by men who had never smelled burnt oil or cordite.
Still, Galland kept flying. In his logbook, each sortie was marked with neat precision, the date, the altitude, the number of rounds expended. He rarely wrote about fear. Fear was acknowledged only through ritual, the tightening of gloves, the double check of ammunition belts, the brief glance toward the wingman before takeoff. When he landed, he smoked in silence, listening to the cooling metal of the engine tick in the twilight. Behind the confident smile shown in propaganda photos was a mind already questioning the structure that commanded him. He met Göring several times during those months. The Reichsmarschall was a flamboyant figure. Medals, velvet uniforms, extravagant meals, even as others rationed bread. Galland respected his experience as a pilot from the First World War, but sensed the decay beneath the pomp. Göring demanded success reports, not truths. Once, when bomber losses became catastrophic, he summoned Galland and asked why his fighters had not destroyed the RAF. Galland, exhausted and blunt, answered, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires." The room froze. It was both a jest and an indictment, the admission that the enemy's aircraft now surpassed Germany's own. Göring forced a laugh, but the insult lingered. By 1941, Galland was appointed General der Jagdflieger, Inspector of Fighters, responsible for all frontline fighter units of the Luftwaffe. He was only 29, handsome, confident, and still flying combat missions. Yet the promotion was a double-edged sword. Now he was chained to Berlin bureaucracy, forced to attend endless conferences where reality was filtered through fear. Reports of Allied production capacity, fuel shortages, and pilot exhaustion were softened before reaching Göring's desk. Galland tried to cut through the fog. He pushed for newer aircraft, more efficient training programs, better tactics. He demanded the mass production of the jet-powered Me-262 as a fighter, not a bomber. Each request collided with political vanity and industrial chaos. In the air, he remained the same, precise, ruthless, elegant. His comrades described him as a man who seemed carved from calmness itself. But under that calm was fatigue. The nights grew longer, the brief moments of sleep filled with the phantom roar of engines. Even at headquarters, he dreamed of dogfights, jolting awake as though struck by tracer fire. The war had become an unending flight that never reached landing speed. He tried to protect his pilots from impossible expectations. When fresh recruits arrived from flight schools, barely able to shoot straight, he refused to throw them into battle without mentorship. He formed schwarms, pairing veterans with newcomers, hoping experience might rub off before death did. But by 1943, attrition was accelerating beyond control. For every ace who survived a year, 10 replacements vanished within a week. The Luftwaffe training system, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing under the weight of its own victories. The faster they expanded, the less capable the new wings became. Galland saw it clearly and spoke plainly. His memoranda to Göring read like warnings carved in stone. Our fuel reserves are insufficient, our pilots are exhausted, our aircraft are inferior in range. Each time, Göring dismissed him as pessimistic. Optimism was demanded, obedience expected. The Reich would not tolerate realism when fantasy was more comforting. As 1943 unfolded, the American presence in the skies intensified. At first, the Germans mocked the daylight bombing raids as suicidal. But when the bombers began returning from deeper and deeper inside the Reich, escorted by fighters that should not have had the fuel to reach such distances, mockery turned to unease. Galland studied combat reports with meticulous attention. The descriptions were consistent. Twin-boom aircraft engaging near the Ruhr Valley, markings of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The P-38 Lightning. His staff debated the data. Some argued misidentification. Others claimed Allied bases must have moved closer to the front. Galland knew better. The Americans had found a way to extend their range, external tanks, new fuel mixtures, tactical planning that stretched endurance to the limit. The implications were enormous. If the bombers could now strike the heart of Germany under constant escort, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy would collapse. He decided to present his findings directly to Göring. That August, he traveled east for a conference, carrying intelligence summaries, photographs, and testimonies. At a railway platform in East Prussia, he paused, watching steam coil above the tracks. Around him, officers chatted, unaware that the documents in his briefcase foretold the death of their air force. When he finally stood before Göring, the conversation unfolded like a tragedy already scripted. Galland explained what his pilots had witnessed. He outlined the physics, the range data, the necessity of immediate adaptation. Göring listened, expression hardening, then waved his hand dismissively. "Impossible," he said. "No American fighter can reach that far. The reports are nonsense." Galland tried again. "But, Herr Reichsmarschall, they have already done it. Our men have seen them." Göring's eyes narrowed. "Then your men are mistaken. I will not have defeatism among my officers." With those words, denial became doctrine. Orders went out forbidding discussion of long-range escorts. Intelligence officers were instructed to focus on bomber tactics instead. Galland left the meeting in silence, the weight of futility pressing on his chest. Outside, the evening sun touched the rails with red light. He knew, as surely as he knew how to fly, that Germany had just lost the war in the air. In the months that followed, he watched his prophecy materialize. The P-38s appeared more frequently, then the P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks, and finally the P-51 Mustang, graceful, lethal, with range that defied belief. The American bomber streams that once suffered catastrophic losses now advanced in shining columns deep into Bavaria and Saxony. German interceptors fell like burning leaves. Galland's reports grew desperate. He proposed reorganizing the fighter force into flexible defense zones, demanded concentration of jets and high-altitude interceptors. Göring ignored him. Instead, he blamed his pilots for cowardice. When Big Week erupted in February 1944, Galland's nightmare was realized. For 6 days, the Allies smashed aircraft factories and airfields, destroying hundreds of fighters in the air and on the ground. The Luftwaffe's best squadrons were annihilated. Galland moved from base to base, trying to coordinate defenses that no longer existed. The once mighty network of radar, command posts, and squadrons had become a ghost structure. The pilots who survived were too few and too tired. Some flew multiple sorties a day, returning only to refuel and take off again. They slept on the ground beside their planes, wrapped in parachutes against the cold. Galland visited them at night, walking between rows of exhausted men. He spoke softly, encouragingly, though he knew words could not refill fuel tanks or resurrect the dead. He too slept little. In those rare hours when he closed his eyes, he saw endless contrails crossing the sky like white scars, heard the echo of engines fading into silence. Sleep became a battlefield he could not win. Rest felt like surrender. Yet even as everything crumbled, he remained composed. Witnesses recalled that Galland never raised his voice. His authority came from clarity. When he addressed his surviving commanders, he did not offer illusions. "We are fighting a battle of extinction," he told them, "but we will fight it with discipline and with honor." Inside, he was grieving for his pilots, for his country, for the truth he had tried to make his superiors see. He began keeping private notes, later to form the basis of his memoirs. In them, he analyzed each failure not as a lament but as a lesson. Leadership without honesty is suicide. Technology without foresight is blindness. Courage without sleep is madness. He understood that even the bravest pilot eventually breaks when denied rest, fuel, and faith. By late 1944, Germany's skies belonged to the Allies. The Me-262 jets finally arrived in numbers too small and too late, burdened by Hitler's insistence that they serve as bombers.
Galland's arguments for a pure interceptor force had been dismissed as insubordination. When he protested again, Göring relieved him of his duties. The man once hailed as the face of the Luftwaffe's courage was now sidelined, accused of defeatism. He spent the last months of the war commanding a small jet unit under direct SS oversight, flying whenever he could. His hair had turned gray at the temples, his eyes ringed with fatigue, but in the cockpit he still felt the same serenity he'd known as a boy watching the storks. The Me-262 soared faster than any propeller plane. For a few fleeting moments, he tasted the future Germany might have had if truth had been valued over vanity. When the war ended, Galland surrendered to American forces. In captivity, he was interrogated not as a war criminal, but as a soldier whose insights were worth studying. His honesty impressed his captors. He admitted Germany's technical brilliance, but emphasized its moral and strategic blindness. "We were given wings," he said, "but we refused to look where the wind was blowing." After his release, he rebuilt a civilian life, advising on aviation, flying occasionally for pleasure. Yet the ghosts of his pilots followed him. Each night he returned to that moment on the platform in 1943, the instant when knowledge met denial and lost. He once wrote that the true tragedy of the Luftwaffe was not defeat by superior machines, but by its own arrogance. Galland remained, until his death, both proud and haunted, a man who had soared higher than most but had seen too clearly the abyss below. To historians, he is remembered as one of the greatest fighter leaders of the Second World War, but to those who read his words carefully, he is something more, a warning about the cost of ignoring reality. He had entered the sky seeking freedom and found only responsibility. In the thin air above Europe, he discovered that courage is not shouting orders from a palace, but telling the truth when no one wants to hear it. And in the end, that truth, the one spoken in vain to a deaf Reichsmarschall, was what defined him. Even now, when we look at photographs of Galland standing beside his aircraft, cigarette in hand, eyes narrowed against the wind, we can almost hear what he might have been thinking. That the sky is vast, that sleep will come only when the engines fall silent, and that a realist in a world of dreamers must often stand alone.
The war in Europe had reached a strange equilibrium by late 1942. The Reich still stretched from the beaches of France to the edge of Stalingrad, but the tide beneath that empire was shifting. In the air, the Allies were learning how to turn distance into power. For decades, strategists had spoken about air supremacy as an abstract dream, the idea that an army could win not by conquering land, but by destroying a nation's ability to fight from above. Yet only in those quiet, calculated rooms in Washington and London did the full scope of that vision take shape. The idea was simple. Its execution would change the world. To defeat Germany, one would not just strike its armies, but dismantle the invisible network that sustained them: fuel, factories, rails, morale. The weapon was the heavy bomber, an airplane that could carry destruction deep into enemy territory and return home. But Germany was vast, and its flak defenses formidable. To succeed, the United States would need to do what no air force had done before: fight a long war in the sky, thousands of miles from safety, against one of the most skilled air forces on Earth. In 1942, the 8th Air Force arrived in England. Its early presence was modest: a few squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flown by young men barely out of high school. They were told their mission was to strike precision targets by daylight, hitting factories, oil refineries, and rail hubs with surgical accuracy. The British, who had been bombing Germany at night for 2 years, quietly doubted the plan. The sky over Europe, they warned, was a cauldron of steel by day. The Luftwaffe still ruled it. But American doctrine, forged in the halls of Maxwell Field and tested in the classrooms of the Air Corps Tactical School, clung to faith in technology. The B-17, with its 4 engines and self-defending gun turrets, was designed to fight its way to the target and back in tight formations.
With the Norden bomb sight, a marvel of mechanical engineering that promised pinpoint accuracy, commanders believed they could cripple the enemy's industry without razing entire cities. It was war with precision, destruction wrapped in the language of morality. The first raids were small, 12 aircraft crossing the North Sea to hit marshalling yards in Rouen or Lille. The men who flew them returned with wild stories, tracer fire arching upward like molten rain, the violent shock of flak bursts that made the air itself seem to tear apart. Some planes came back with holes the size of doors in their fuselages. Others vanished completely, swallowed by cloud and smoke. Still, the idea held. Each mission was a lesson. Crews learned to fly tighter, gunners learned to track faster, and commanders learned that courage was as fragile as aluminum. They began to mark time not by dates, but by missions. The 10th, the 15th, the 20th, counting down to the magic number of 25, the limit after which one could go home. Few made it that far in those early months. By mid-1943, the U.S. strategy shifted from testing to assault. The goal was no longer demonstration, but domination. The air chiefs, Ira Eaker, then later Carl Spaatz and Jimmy Doolittle, looked at the map of Europe as a giant machine. To break it, they reasoned, one must strike its critical points. The ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, the aircraft assembly lines of Regensburg, the oil fields of Ploiești, the rail hubs at Kassel and Hanover. Each of these targets was defended not just by flak, but by the Luftwaffe's fighter wings, commanded by men like Adolf Galland. It was a duel of philosophies as much of firepower. Galland believed in maneuver, surprise, and the art of air combat. The Americans believed in math, in altitude, formation geometry, and overlapping fields of defensive fire. One fought with instinct, the other with doctrine. When these two worlds met above the clouds, the sky became a graveyard of certainty.
The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943 were the first great test. 600 bombers lifted off from English airfields before dawn, their engines shaking the ground. Civilians came out of their cottages to watch the silver waves climb into the morning light. Inside each plane, men sat in silence, listening to the endless hum of engines and the occasional voice crackling through intercom. "Tighten it up, boys. Keep it close." The mission plan was complex. One force would strike the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, another the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Together, they would cripple Germany's aircraft production and the bearings that kept its war machine moving. It was meant to be a masterstroke. Instead, it became a massacre. As the bombers crossed the coast, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s dove from the sun, raking the formation with cannon fire. The Americans fought back, gunners firing in every direction, tracer lines converging in bursts of flame. Planes exploded mid-air, breaking apart like torn paper. Parachutes bloomed among the contrails, white flowers over a field of death. At Regensburg, the surviving bombers dropped their loads and turned south toward bases in North Africa, as planned. But those bound for Schweinfurt were not so lucky. The Luftwaffe regrouped and struck again, wave after wave, all the way to the target and back. By the time the last bomber limped home, 60 had been lost. Hundreds of men were missing. The factories were damaged but not destroyed. The lesson was clear. Without long-range escort fighters, daylight bombing was suicide. In England, generals debated. Some argued to halt the offensive until new aircraft arrived. Others insisted that loss was the price of progress. The crews, for their part, grew quiet. They drank their coffee in mess halls and stared at the empty chairs of friends who hadn't returned. The sound of engines overhead no longer filled them with pride, but with dread. The high command pressed on. They had no choice. In the corridors of the Pentagon and the War Department, production figures and timelines formed a different kind of front line. The U.S. had promised its allies dominance in the air. Retreat now would fracture the alliance. And so they flew again, to Bremen, to Stuttgart, to Münster, each time deeper, each time bloodier. Then came the breakthrough, the long-range escort fighter. It began as a whisper in engineering departments. Could a fighter plane stay with the bombers all the way to Germany and back?
The solution was deceptively simple: external drop tanks, aerodynamic refinements, and the merging of power with endurance. The result was the P-51 Mustang. Sleek, fast, and agile, it could fly over 1,600 kilometers with tanks attached. When Galland's pilots first reported seeing them over the heart of the Reich, Göring laughed. He thought it impossible. But the impossible was already happening.
By late 1943, small numbers of P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts had begun to accompany the bomber streams. Their presence reduced losses, but it was the arrival of the P-51 that transformed the war. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe could no longer pick off bombers at leisure. The hunters had become the hunted. With escorts guarding them all the way to Berlin, the bombers could now reach targets that had once been untouchable. The Americans called it the point-blank directive, a coordinated plan to destroy the German Air Force on the ground and in the air before the planned invasion of Europe. The logic was brutal but precise. Before one could land on Normandy's beaches, the skies above them had to be safe. The winter of 1943-44 saw the culmination of that vision. It was called Big Week. For 7 days in February, the 8th Air Force and its British counterpart launched over 3,000 sorties against aircraft factories, fuel depots, and assembly plants. The Luftwaffe rose desperately to defend them, and in doing so, played into Allied hands. Every German fighter destroyed in the air was one less to oppose the invasion later. The losses were staggering on both sides. Smoke hung over the Rhineland for days, black plumes twisting into the cold air. On the ground, civilians stared upward, unable to distinguish friend from foe, only machines and fire falling endlessly. Yet behind the horror, the logic held. The German aircraft industry was crippled. The Luftwaffe, bled of its best pilots, could no longer replace them fast enough. By the spring of 1944, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible: daylight control of the air. American formations could now cross Germany almost unchallenged. They began striking not just factories, but the arteries of the nation: bridges, fuel plants, rail junctions. The bombs fell with terrifying precision, though precision is always a relative word in war. Entire districts vanished. Oil became scarce. The German army, once mobile and mechanized, began fighting on foot. And still, the raids continued, even at night, alternating with the British bombing campaigns. The theory of round-the-clock bombing became reality. Sleep itself disappeared from Germany. Sirens howled in the darkness, children were carried to shelters, and the sound of engines overhead became a kind of mechanical lullaby of fear. For the men who flew these missions, sleep was also a stranger. They woke before dawn, strapped into freezing cabins for 8-hour flights, then stumbled back to their bunks with their hands still trembling. The smell of gun oil and sweat clung to their clothes. In the stillness of the barracks, some dreamed of home, others of fire. Many dreamed of falling. There was a rhythm to it, a cycle of flight and exhaustion, of takeoff and loss. Each morning, the control towers watched squadrons lift into the sky, and each evening they counted who returned. The missing were not forgotten. They were simply absorbed into the great ledger of war. By June 1944, the stage was set. The German skies, once defended by thousands of fighters, were open enough for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, to begin. When Allied troops stormed the beaches, American and British bombers roared overhead, striking rail lines and troop concentrations far behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. The war of attrition fought in the air had decided the battle on the ground before it began. But the cost was almost unbearable. Between 1942 and 1945, over 26,000 men of the 8th Air Force were killed, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. For every factory destroyed, for every city burned, there were crews who never came home. In their letters, one finds the paradox of the air war: pride and terror intertwined. "We're making history," one gunner wrote before a mission to Leipzig. "But God, I wish history would hurry up and end." The final phase of the U.S. strategy targeted oil, the lifeblood of modern war.
Galland had foreseen it years earlier, warning that fuel would decide the Luftwaffe's fate. By mid-1944, Allied bombers focused relentlessly on refineries and synthetic fuel plants. The results were catastrophic. Without fuel, the German jets could barely train, tanks could not move, and trucks were abandoned on the roads. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft were often grounded not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. The balance of exhaustion had reversed. Now it was German pilots who looked skyward with dread, their sleep broken by the same sound that once comforted them, the steady, distant rumble of engines. The sky, which had once been Galland's sanctuary, was now a prison filled with enemies. In the end, the American strategy achieved what its architects intended, though not in the way they imagined. Precision bombing became area bombing. The dream of moral warfare dissolved in the heat of necessity. But the effect was undeniable. The Reich's heart had been hollowed out from above. When victory came, it was not marked by a single explosion, but by silence. The silence of a sky finally empty. And in that silence, the men who had survived tried to sleep again. Some found rest easily, lulled by the knowledge that the world was safe. Others could not close their eyes without seeing the glow of burning cities beneath them. History calls it strategic bombing. They called it duty. But in the quiet between wars, both names meant the same thing: the memory of fire that would never fully fade.
Bei late 1943, der Sound von Twin Engines begann zu haunten die Skies von Europa. Der P-51 Lightning, sleek, silbern und streng mit seinen Twin-Booms, hat erreicht. Es konnte fliegen ferner, denn any German Pilot ermahnte. Es Range streckte deep into enemy airspace. An dem Morgen von August 17, die Lightnings eskortierte Bombers über Regensburg, gleitend über den Clouds like mirrored ghosts. Für die first time, die B-17s machte es heim mit krippelnden Losses. Die Interceptor scrambleten, but der neue Fighter danced beyond reach. Its Power kam von 2 engines, its precision von einer Single Purpose: zu öffnen der Sky. Pilots sprachen von der Lightning als alive, temperamentell, yet loyal. Treat her gently, einer sagte, und she'll bring you home. When use of its range riechte Hermann Göring, disbelief turned to anger. He had called it impossible. Long-range fighters defying distance itself. Now evidence filled the reports on his desk. Burned airfields, lost squadrons, vanishing bombers. The denial that began on a railway platform with Galland was unraveling in fire on contrails. From that day, the balance shifted. The Lightning's shadow stretched across Europa, heralding a new phase of war. No target was beyond reach, no sky truly safe. Zu den Allies it was freedom on wings, zu der Luftwaffe eine silent prophecy proved that the impossible had ally come true.
The summer of 1943 burned like no other. From the skies above the North Sea came waves of bombers, moving through moonlit corridors of cloud. Below them lay Hamburg, the great port city of Germany, its streets glimmering faintly beneath blackout curtains. On the night of July 27, the air was heavy and still. It was the silence before a storm that would change the very shape of war. The first flares dropped at midnight, pale blossoms of light marking the target zone. Within moments, the heavens erupted. The sound was not thunder, but a living roar. Engines, bombs, collapsing steel. Fire spread faster than men could run. Whole neighborhoods vanished in a single breath of flame. From miles away, pilots could see the inferno rising like a pillar to the clouds. Among those in the air that night were American and British crews flying long-range missions once thought impossible. The Lightning escorts had guided them in, slipping between bursts of flak, turning the impossible into routine. What had begun with Galland's warnings in 1943 had now become a new kind of warfare, one of reach, endurance, and total destruction. Inside Germany, the effect was shattering. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend every front, every city. Galland's report spoke of exhausted pilots, shattered airfields, and growing disbelief. Even as the flames of Hamburg smoldered, he wrote bitterly, "We are no longer fighting for victory, but for time." And so, beneath the fading stars, the bombers turned west again, leaving behind a city that no longer existed. The smoke reached 20,000 feet, drifting into the same sky where the P-38s once soared. The firestorm of Hamburg was not just a military event. It was the moment when the air war crossed the threshold from strategy to nightmare. Winter settled over Europe like a long breath of ash. The year was turning, and with it, the last illusions of Luftwaffe supremacy were dying in the cold air above the Reich. From his office in Berlin, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland watched the snow fall against the windows of a war machine that no longer believed in itself. On his desk lay reports written in a familiar rhythm of defeat, sorties flown, losses mounting, fuel diminishing. He read each one carefully, pencil in hand, the same way a surgeon studies the pulse of a dying patient. "We are fighting ghosts," one squadron leader wrote. "They come from the west and vanish before we can touch them." Those ghosts were the P-38 Lightnings and, soon, the P-51 Mustangs, long-range escorts that now followed bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Every warning Galland had given in 1943 had become reality, only no one dared say it aloud. Meetings with Göring had grown unbearable. The Reichsmarschall still demanded optimism, still spoke of secret weapons and final victories. Galland, once his golden pilot, now stood before him as an unwelcome reminder of failure. "You always see the negative side," Göring snapped. "Where is your faith?" "My faith," Galland answered quietly, "was in the men who are gone." Outside, the roar of engines echoed faintly from distant airfields, training flights for boys barely out of school. The veterans who had once dominated the skies were gone, replaced by teenagers flying machines they barely understood. Oil was scarce, replacement parts rarer still. What had been an elite air force was now a desperate collection of memories. Galland visited units at the front whenever he could, moving through frozen hangars where mechanics worked in silence. The young pilots greeted him with shy reverence, their faces pale beneath the frost. He would shake each hand, ask their names, look into eyes that reminded him of 1940, the summer of triumph, when the Luftwaffe had owned the skies. Now he saw only exhaustion and quiet acceptance. "Do not die for a slogan," he told them softly. "Fight for each other, and come home if you can." His memos to Berlin became bolder, almost pleading. He warned that the training system had collapsed, that morale was dissolving faster than aircraft. He argued for defensive strategies, for conserving the few experienced pilots left. But every proposal met the same wall of pride. Göring dismissed him, and Hitler himself refused to believe the air war could be lost. "We will strike back with new jets," they said, the Me-262, the miracle yet to come. Galland knew better. He had seen the faces of men who fought with empty tanks and frozen hands. He had watched the sky fill with contrails, hundreds of American bombers, escorted by gleaming Mustangs, moving like a single organism. The sky itself had turned American. No courage could change that. By early 1944, Galland's tone in his diary grew mournful. "Our tragedy," he wrote, "is not that we are beaten, but that we refused to see it when there was still time." The Luftwaffe still launched raids, still claimed victories, but each success was smaller, each cost higher. Even the weather seemed to conspire, endless gray days that made navigation treacherous and fatigue unbearable. In March, Galland stood on a windswept airfield near Hanover as another group of fighters took off to intercept incoming bombers. They climbed into the clouds and vanished. Minutes later, columns of smoke rose on the horizon. The bombers had broken through again. He turned away from the sight, his greatcoat whipping in the wind. For the first time in his career, he felt something colder than fear: inevitability. The next month, Göring relieved him of his post. Officially, it was for health reasons. In truth, it was for honesty. The man who had once been the voice of the Luftwaffe was silenced at the moment when truth was needed most. That night, Galland wrote his final report. It was short, almost serene. "We no longer command the air. We are merely surviving within it. The sky belongs to those who believed in what was possible." He folded the paper, sealed it, and looked out the window toward the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond it, the engines of Allied bombers were already approaching, steady, relentless, inevitable. And as the first rumble reached his ears, Galland whispered to himself words that might have belonged to any pilot of any nation. The war is not lost in the air. It is lost in the refusal to see. By the spring of 1944, the sound of the air war had changed. It no longer came in waves of bombers moving alone through thin skies. It came with an escort that seemed endless. Silver, elegant, and fast, the P-51 Mustang had arrived. To the German radar operators, it was another blip on the screen, another American design to decode. But to the men who faced it in combat, the Mustang felt almost supernatural. It could fly faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field at altitude, climb like a hawk, and stay aloft for hours, even reaching Berlin and returning without refueling. The first time Galland heard of it, he dismissed it as rumor. When the first reports came from frontline squadrons describing its range and maneuverability, he read them in silence. The impossible had happened again, just as it had with the P-38. Göring's denial had bought them nothing but time, and time was now running out. The Mustang was everything the Allies needed rolled into one machine. With its sleek laminar flow wings and its British Merlin engine, it was both beautiful and merciless. Pilots described it as effortless to fly, like an extension of thought. Once airborne, it could hunt anywhere. The Germans called it der leichte Tod, the light death. For the bomber crews, the Mustang was salvation. Where once they had faced the long, lonely stretch into Germany with no help but luck, now they watched as Mustangs dance in tight formation beside them, turning into the sun to intercept incoming fighters. "We weren't alone anymore," one gunner said years later. The Mustangs were angels with teeth. As the squadrons multiplied, the effect was devastating. The Luftwaffe could no longer mass for an attack without losing half its fighters before they even reached the bombers. Galland watched as the numbers came in, hundreds of aircraft lost in a single week. He knew what it meant. The air war, the one they had once dominated, was over. From the ground, the sight of Mustangs glinting above contrails was both magnificent and final. Even civilians could tell the difference. They flew lower, freer, faster, like predators that owned the sky. The old German aces who survived the early years knew what they were seeing. It was not just defeat, it was evolution. Galland wrote in his journal that April, "When we see them above us, we are looking at the future, a future that no longer includes us." On May mornings, when the light stretched long over the fields of northern France, the sound of their engines carried far into the countryside. Steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. Farmers would stop their work, listening to the low thunder rolling across the horizon. It was the music of inevitability. The Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had conquered distance, fear, and the myth of invulnerability that had defined the Luftwaffe. Every new sortie marked another step toward the invasion that everyone sensed was coming. By June, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. And when D-Day came, the Mustangs circled above the beaches like silent guardians, ensuring that no enemy pilot would disturb the dawn. For Galland, watching from a command post far inland, the realization was quiet and absolute. The war in the air had ended, not with surrender, but with the simple, undeniable truth that the future favored those who dared to imagine farther than their enemies believed possible. On May mornings, when the light stretched long over the fields of northern France, the sound of their engines carried far into the countryside. Steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. Farmers would stop their work, listening to the low thunder rolling across the horizon. It was the music of inevitability. The Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had conquered distance, fear, and the myth of invulnerability that had defined the Luftwaffe. Every new sortie marked another step toward the invasion that everyone sensed was coming. By June, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. And when D-Day came, the Mustangs circled above the beaches like silent guardians, ensuring that no enemy pilot would disturb the dawn. For Galland, watching from a command post far inland, the realization was quiet and absolute. The war in the air had ended, not with surrender, but with the simple, undeniable truth that the future favored those who dared to imagine farther than their enemies believed possible.
February 1944, the month the sky itself turned against the Luftwaffe. The Allies called it Big Week, a campaign of relentless airstrikes designed to shatter German aircraft production once and for all. For 6 straight days, the thunder of engines never ceased. Hundreds of bombers filled the heavens, escorted by swarms of P-51s and P-38s that stretched across the horizon like a living wave of silver light. At first, the German High Command refused to believe such intensity could be sustained. But by the second day, disbelief gave way to dread. Every major factory, airfield, and railway hub from Leipzig to Regensburg was burning. Galland's phone never stopped ringing. Reports, losses, desperate calls for reinforcements that no longer existed. Each message began the same way: "We are under attack." From airfields buried in snow, what remained of the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept. The young pilots who rose into the freezing morning air were brave, but courage could no longer close the gap between experience and extinction. The Mustangs were waiting, high above the bombers, patient and invisible until the moment of descent. Then came the dive, clean, fast, and final. Over Oschersleben, the air turned into a storm of smoke and fragments. One German formation of 60 fighters went up, 12 came back. For the Americans, it was the first proof that control of the sky could be absolute. For the Germans, it was the moment of fracture, the week when belief broke before reality. Galland traveled to the front lines in person, his uniform heavy with frost. He stood beside wrecked aircraft, touching their shattered wings as though they were the remains of fallen comrades. He tried to speak to the young mechanics, but words felt hollow. "We can still fight," one of them said. Galland nodded, though his eyes betrayed him. He had seen the future, and it no longer wore the Iron Cross. When he returned to Berlin, the air smelled of smoke and failure. Göring still demanded optimism, Hitler still spoke of vengeance, but Galland's reports grew shorter, more precise, stripped of illusion. "We have lost the war in the air," he wrote. "The enemy now dictates not only where we fight, but when we breathe." By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 260 fighters. Many of the best remaining pilots were gone. The factories that built their replacements lay in ruins. The balance had not merely shifted, it had collapsed. And yet, for those who survived, there was a strange stillness after the storm. The skies, once filled with the defiant roar of engines, now seemed wider, emptier, quieter. The Luftwaffe was no longer a force of destiny. It was a memory, dissolving into contrails and silence. From that silence rose the steady hum of Allied dominance, a sound that would carry across Europe until the very end. By the summer of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. What once had been the proud hunting ground of the Luftwaffe had turned into a graveyard of smoke trails and wreckage scattered across the fields. Each dawn brought the same sound, the distant growl of Allied engines, endless and unchallenged. Adolf Galland stood at a window in his command office, staring at the map that no longer needed updating.
Every front, every city, every factory, all within range of Allied bombers. The lines of defense that once seemed impenetrable were now just symbols of memory. "The eagle has fallen," he whispered, tracing the shape of the Reich with a gloved hand. In the beginning, the collapse came slowly, through shortages, through fatigue, through silence. Then, like a breached dam, it all gave way at once. Pilots flew with barely trained wingmen, their aircraft fueled with whatever reserves could be found. The great aces of the Luftwaffe were gone, killed, captured, or grounded by lack of fuel. Those who replaced them were boys, barely 20, their faces pale in the cockpit light. They launched into impossible odds, their courage both admirable and tragic. Galland visited the squadrons when he could. He watched them prepare for sorties that would almost certainly end in fire. Some joked, some prayed, some wrote letters they would never send. And above it all, the Allied fighters circled like hawks, waiting for the next movement of prey. Even the rhythm of life on the ground had changed. Airfields that once buzzed with confidence now echoed with emptiness. Mechanics used salvaged parts to keep a few planes flying, knowing they might never return. The once glorious Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, symbols of German pride, sat abandoned under camouflage nets, their paint dulled by dust and despair. When the Normandy invasion came in June, Galland knew there was nothing left to stop it. The Luftwaffe managed only 2 aircraft over the beaches that day. 2 against thousands. The air war was no longer a contest, it was a surrender written in the sky. Göring still raged, blaming everyone but himself. "If our pilots had courage," he said, "they would turn the tide." Galland did not answer. He had seen courage, endless courage, wasted by arrogance and denial. In his reports, Galland no longer spoke of victory or hope. His words became like eulogies. "The fighter arm," he wrote in July, "is dead in spirit before it is dead in number." Sometimes at night, he would walk alone through the hangars, his boots echoing against the metal floor. The smell of oil and burnt rubber still lingered. He would pause beside a wrecked fighter, its wings torn and its cockpit glass shattered, and imagine the roar it once made, the sound of a nation that believed it could rule the sky forever. But now the sky was silent. Only the wind moved between the hangars, whispering through the ruins. The eagle that had once soared was broken, its feathers scattered across the continent. And in that silence, Galland finally understood the truth he had been warning about since that railway platform in 1943. It wasn't the enemy that destroyed them, it was the refusal to see reality until it was too late. Autumn 1944. The leaves turned gray with ash before they could fall. The once proud airfields of Germany were now open wounds upon the landscape, marked by craters and twisted wrecks. Every sunrise began with the drone of Allied bombers. Every night ended in the faint red glow of distant cities burning. Adolf Galland, now tired beyond his years, spent his mornings writing. The reports were his last duty, precise, cold, but deeply human beneath the surface. He no longer used the language of victory or strategy. Instead, his words were stripped down to truth. "The fighter force," he wrote, "exists only in fragments. Our training units are destroyed. Our reserves are gone. Our spirit is bleeding away." He had once been the face of the Luftwaffe's pride, the young, daring ace with a cigar clenched between his teeth and the confidence of invincibility in his eyes. Now he was a man surrounded by silence, his hair streaked with gray, his uniform worn thin. The world around him had changed beyond recognition, but his duty had not, to tell the truth no matter how unwelcome. When he visited Berlin to deliver his final assessment, the air smelled of smoke and dust. Göring sat in his office surrounded by empty promises, blueprints for jet fighters, miracle weapons, secret plans that could never be built. "We will rise again," Göring said, his voice trembling between rage and delusion. Galland placed the report on the desk and spoke quietly. "We will not rise again, my Reichsmarschall, not like this." The room fell silent. Göring's eyes flickered with disbelief, the same disbelief that had greeted Galland's warnings a year earlier about the P-38s and the Mustangs, the same blindness that had brought them here. Galland turned and walked out without waiting for a response. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. Above the city, contrails crossed like scars, glowing faintly in the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft guns rumbled like distant thunder, the heartbeat of a dying nation. He returned to his quarters that night and sat at his desk, staring at the map of Europe. The front lines were no longer lines. They were fractures, spreading wider every day. He reached for his pen and added one final note to his report. "The end will not come from without, but from within. We have fought the enemy in the air, but lost the battle for truth on the ground." He folded the paper carefully and sealed it with the precision of a soldier who still believed in order, even in ruin. Then, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Outside, the sound of distant engines carried through the night, steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. The same sound that had once inspired him now lulled him into stillness. It was the lullaby of defeat, the song of a sky that no longer belonged to him. And in that quiet, Galland's legacy was sealed, not in victory, but in clarity. He had seen the truth before anyone else, and though no one listened, history would.
April 1945. The air over Germany had gone quiet at last, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The once endless drone of engines, the rattle of gunfire, the hum of war, had faded into a kind of haunted stillness. Fields that once launched squadrons now lay abandoned, their runways cracked, their hangars collapsed beneath the weight of silence. Adolf Galland stood at the edge of one such airfield, the wind tugging at his long coat. Around him, the remnants of the Luftwaffe were scattered, a few broken Me-262s gleaming like ghosts in the dim light. The war had ended, even if no one had yet spoken the word aloud. He had flown his last mission weeks earlier, leading a small formation of jets in a hopeless attempt to defend Munich. The sortie lasted only minutes before fuel ran out and the enemy appeared from every direction. Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, the old names that had once sounded impossible. Galland had returned to base alone, his guns empty, his spirit heavier than the sky itself. Now, as he looked over the wreckage, the memories came in waves. The first victories, the laughter of young pilots who believed they were untouchable, the disbelief on Göring's face when Galland had warned him about long-range fighters. He remembered the railway platform in East Prussia, August 17, 1943, where the truth had first been spoken and ignored. From that moment, every contrail, every loss, every silence had led here. He bent down and ran a hand over the wing of a ruined jet. The metal was cold, still smelling faintly of burned fuel. "You could have changed everything," he whispered, "if only they had listened." A messenger approached, breathless, uniform torn. "Herr General, Berlin has fallen." Galland nodded once. There was nothing more to say. He returned to his office, or what was left of it, and opened his final notebook. The pages were smudged with soot and oil. His handwriting, though trembling, remained precise. "Our defeat was not born in the air, but in blindness. The enemy learned, adapted, believed. We denied, doubted, and delayed. The sky punishes arrogance without mercy." He paused, listening to the wind moving through the broken rafters. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, or perhaps it was artillery. It no longer mattered. Galland closed the notebook and placed it beside his flight goggles. For a long moment, he watched the horizon, where a faint line of sunlight pushed through the clouds. There was beauty still, even in ruin.
He thought of the men who had flown with him, the boys who never came back, the laughter that once filled the barracks, the songs they sang before takeoff. Their voices seemed to drift through the air now, gentle and far away, as if the past itself were whispering farewell. He lit one last cigar, the smoke curling upward like a fading contrail, and spoke softly to the empty air. "May the sky forgive us." Then he walked away from the airfield, leaving behind the machines, the memories, and the silence. Above him, a single Allied aircraft crossed the clouds, its engines low and even. Galland looked up, not with anger, but with recognition. The future had arrived long ago. He had simply been born too early to reach it. And as he disappeared into the gray distance, the wind carried the echo of the old Luftwaffe motto, barely audible, almost prayer-like. Higher, faster, farther. But now it was not a boast, it was a eulogy. The eagle had made its last flight. And the sky, vast and eternal, belonged to no one.